Hi everyone, it's good to be with you today. I'm sorry that I can't speak Spanish, but I hope the translations work okay. Following on from what Steph has told you, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into how Chinese state-owned enterprises work and how China's development financing system works, so we can get a better sense of how the BRI really operates in practice. So when we talk about the BRI, we often see maps like this that suggest that the whole thing is this carefully thought out blueprint to build transboundary infrastructure across the world. And often the way that China is talked about gives the impression that this is all something planned in Beijing and is part of a cunning grand strategy. The implication is that President Xi Jinping is sitting in Beijing like a Bond villain, stroking his white cat and chuckling to himself as he plans a scheme for world domination. Now, I think in some ways, as Steph has hinted at, this recalls earlier ideas about China as spreading its tentacles throughout the world, and it's really not very truthful about how China really works in practice. As Steph says, we really have to unpack China and the Chinese. And she's emphasized that the Belt and Road Initiative is broad, loose framework designed to steer a whole host of different actors that are very fragmented and decentralized. There is, in fact, no map or blueprint. There is no central plan that says this is where certain things should be built. They're only unofficial maps, and they were banned in 2017, so there certainly isn't a blueprint. And really, what happens in the Belt and Road Initiative reflects a broader shift in the way the Chinese party state operates as China has transitioned towards capitalism since the 1980s. So if we think about state-owned enterprises, initially under the old Maoist regime, state-owned enterprises were ministries or part of government ministries. And in the 1980s and 1990s, these enterprises were spun off from these ministries. The ministries themselves were abolished, and these enterprises became standalone enterprises. The smaller ones were privatized. The bigger ones were consolidated. They were put together into big conglomerates in the 1990s and 2000s, and they were corporatized. Process of corporatization means that these state-owned enterprises that used to be run as political units became freestanding enterprises. They were often floated on stock exchanges, sometimes domestic, sometimes foreign, and their main purpose was shifted to making profit. Now, the top managers of state-owned enterprises, both national and subnational, are still appointed by the Chinese Communist Party, but they are now primarily evaluated on their ability to make money. State-owned enterprises are also quite loosely and weakly regulated. So if we look at the way that the Chinese party state regulates state-owned enterprises, we can see that there are many different actors involved, many different regulators. There's the National Development and Reform Commission, there's the Ministry of Commerce, there are subnational governments, there is the People's Bank of China, there are functional ministries, there are there's the State-Owned Assets and Supervision Commission, there are banks, there's the Communist Party's inspection teams, and their industry associations. So it's a very complex regulatory environment that try to supervise state-owned enterprises, and lots of these agencies overlap. They do not have clearly defined responsibilities. The regulations that they have often overlap or are contradictory, and they're often very vague anyway. So the Chinese party state tends to produce lots of suggestions and guidelines and opinions rather than hard and fast law. So these are often very vague and loose. They give a broad sense of the direction of travel and the kinds of things that one should do or shouldn't do, but they're rarely detailed and specific. And also these agencies have a lack of external monitoring capacity. So of all these agencies listed, only the Ministry of Commerce has personnel overseas. They staff the commercial bureau within Chinese embassies, but they largely see their role as assisting the external expansion of state-owned enterprises rather than supervising them. So there are all these different agencies in China. They are quite fragmented and not very well coordinated, and they don't have really clear view of what's happening on the ground when state-owned enterprises go abroad. There's a lot of reliance, in fact, on host state regulation. So the countries where state-owned enterprises are operating, they're expected to step up and actually supervise Chinese enterprises in their domains. So although supervision and regulation has tightened in recent years, it's still quite a fragmented, inefficient system. So in practice, state-owned enterprises have a great deal of practical autonomy when they operate overseas. Since they're primarily interested in making profit, that means state-owned enterprises pursue profitable business opportunities, lucrative projects, and they are often prepared to skate around Chinese and host state regulations and engage in highly questionable practices in order to get business opportunities. Now, China's development financing system is also very fragmented and is a loose governance system. The key to understanding development financing, which includes the Belt and Road Initiative, is that Chinese development financing is recipient-led. Now, by that I mean that China does not offer aid in a unsolicited way. The recipient, the would-be recipient, must apply to China for assistance for various projects. So Chinese aid has always been recipient-led since the 1950s. The applications from recipients are then reviewed in Beijing by a multi-agency group, which includes many of the actors on the previous slide. They will conduct discussions amongst themselves with policy banks and the state-owned enterprises in a given sector who might be interested in doing a project that's wanted by a would-be recipient. And if they approve the application, they will arrange the financing, typically from a policy bank, such as the Chinese Development Bank or the China Export-Import Bank. And they will then conduct a process whereby they select a state-owned enterprise to actually conduct and implement the project. And there's often a competitive tendering process within China because these state-owned enterprises want to get these projects. And then a contract will be offered to the recipient country to agree to a loan, and they will get the tied aid contract. So this is how projects basically come into being. Now, there are a number of problems with this system that allow bad outcomes to happen. So the first is that because it's recipient-led, this process allows state-owned enterprises to work with foreign governments to put together applications. So state-owned enterprises that want to get profitable business in other countries will often try to look for opportunities in those countries and then encourage governments to apply to Beijing for money that can then go to that state-owned enterprise. On the other hand, the recipient government may be driven by a need for certain infrastructure projects. There is a great need for infrastructure investment across the world, but especially in developing countries. But they may also be driven by greed. So construction sector in particular is a very corrupt sector all across the world and is very good for producing kickbacks for politically linked businesses and for extracting rents and bribes. And also infrastructure projects can be directed towards politicians' favoured districts, such as their home areas. There's a lot of quantitative evidence that Chinese investment and development projects are often aimed at the home area of ruling elites, for example. And that means that this is not a rational process of selecting and designing a project that will definitely be a great project and deliver development. Projects can be very ill-conceived by the host government or by the state-owned enterprise or both. And then when the application is reviewed in Beijing, there's a number of problems with that system too. The system is biased towards helping state-owned enterprises expand their business overseas. The whole system is geared in that direction. There's also a lack of knowledge about the nature of the societies in which development financing is taking place. There is extreme ignorance of different societies outside of China, very little expertise, a very little understanding of the political risks in those societies. They also have very inadequate processes for evaluating and managing risk. So these agencies don't well understand the different risks that may be faced for development financing and projects in other countries. And they don't necessarily know how to manage these risks properly. And so approval for projects can often be given without proper due diligence. The financiers will mainly be concerned that they get their money back. So as long as the loan is guaranteed by the host government, they might not ask too many questions. And then during the implementation process, there's a real weakness here because, as I mentioned earlier on, these agencies don't have people on the ground in recipient countries to look at how projects are being implemented. So a lot of problems can emerge during the implementation process that the regulators and officials in Beijing are completely unaware of until it maybe explodes through social or political unrest or some kind of diplomatic trouble. And that's often the only stage at which the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is a very weak ministry in China, becomes aware of a problem and is brought in to clean up the mess. So in conclusion, the Belt and Road Initiative is not something that's simply planned single-handedly by China. It is very much the interaction between the interests and institutions on the Chinese side, but also the interests and institutions on the recipient side. And if we want to understand the nature of projects under the Belt and Road, we need to look at both those sides of things. And for activists too, we need to be lobbying both the Chinese side and also the recipient side. Thank you.